Yeah, since we started requiring our electric and natural gas utilities to make investments in energy efficiency on behalf of their customers, we've saved in Minnesota probably the equivalent of 3 or 4 large power plants. This has saved consumers millions and millions of dollars. Consider the fact that most efficiency investments, at least on the electricity side, come in at around a penny to 2 pennies a kilowatt hour, and you're looking at most new supply options at 8 to 10 cents and above. So again, it's a fairly obvious thing that we should be maximizing our opportunities to invest in efficiency wherever we can. And when you compare Minnesota and the US to most other countries, most first world countries around the world, we're so much less efficient. We waste so much energy. Part of that is that, again, as I said before, we've had historically, and I believe artificially low energy prices that have led to waste. There is no real consequence for most consumers to leaving lights on, to not buying that more efficient appliance. And as a result, we have a very inefficient energy system and one that has lots of room to squeeze efficiencies out of it.
I have a specific question about solar. Great things about these iPhones. On the Minnesota website, you say Minnesota has more annual solar energy potential than Houston and nearly as much as Miami, Florida. And then when you open your comments about the inefficiency of the transmission line, we lose a lot of power between the plant and our homes or our offices when we get there. Solar solves that problem in essence because you're using it, you're generating at the point of use. And I think across the world, solar, we talked about incentive. My specific question is, what are your positions on the feed-in tariff? We look at Spain, we look at Germany. That the feed-in tariff concept used there was most successful in getting solar take off in those countries. We see it in a few states in the U.S. Question about where Minnesota stands on the feed-in tariff.
And if you could kind of explain what it is, too.
Actually, I think I'll have Mr. Grant explain what it is. I'm not sure I can characterize it in a...
Sure. Well, very simply, a feed-in tariff is simply an agreement on the part of the electric utility to pay a guaranteed price for energy from certain energy supply technologies. And my view on that is that were it not for the fact that Minnesota's already adopted a nation-leading renewable electricity standard, 25% by the year 2025, that a feed-in tariff might very well make sense. And there may still be a room for a feed-in tariff for solar and some of the technologies that are still considerably more expensive than wind power is, for example, and limiting that to smaller systems that will otherwise have a lot of difficulty getting onto the grid, but that we would really like to see take off. You mentioned the Spanish example, and I don't know whether this was coming from a news source that just had a bias against solar or feed-in tariffs or what have you, but the most recent news that I saw was that the obligation that Spain has created for itself financially from its feed-in tariff now amounts to about 25% of the country's annual budget. And they've just had to suspend the feed-in tariff for that reason. Now, I think that's probably a design issue as much as anything else. They've obviously opened the doors a little too wide and agreed to pay for things that really aren't even remotely economic. But again, if it weren't for the fact that we're already, I think, on a pretty progressive course with respect to acquiring new renewable sources, I'm not sure about a wholesale feed-in tariff as an alternative.
So I did not plant this question either. So the concept is, and I understand why people are enamored of it, that you guarantee a big enough price that somebody could do solar and make a profit at it. But Bill, when he was giving his litany, and I'm not sure I agree with every bit of the relative cost of the various fuels, but solar is not competitive at this time. And that's not to say we shouldn't be doing some experiments. We have 1,800 megawatts of wind, we have about 2 megawatts of solar, and we're trying to do another couple of megawatts of solar. And I think those experiments should move forward on a pilot project to see how we can integrate it with our grid to pick up those efficiencies that you mentioned in our distribution and our transmission systems. Local generation close to load has those ancillary externalities that a lot of the wind out in southwestern Minnesota, as useful as it is, don't provide. But it's useful to see everybody throws out, let's do what they do in Europe. Here in the US, I looked this up last night on the Energy Information Administration's website, US Department of Energy. These are 2007 figures. So in a US dollar equivalent per kilowatt hour, in America, the United States, we pay a little over 10 cents a kilowatt hour. That's the whole country blended together. 10 cents a kilowatt hour for power. In Spain, it's 16 and a half. In Germany, it's 22.2. And in Denmark, a lot of folks point to Denmark and their, the high penetration of wind power there, is 32.2. And simply, I'll put this fairly simply. Germany has a very large manufacturing and industrial sector, but I would have to say that a lot of our manufacturing, industrial, and commercial sector wouldn't be competitive with power at 32 cents a kilowatt hour. The feed-in tariff's been hugely successful if you look at it from the standpoint of how much solar they have in a country where the sun doesn't shine all that often. So from a standpoint of getting penetration of a particular favored resource, it does great work, but in keeping prices competitive to the consumer and in keeping our economy competitive in the world economy, it doesn't do so well.
So if you were going to pick one of the renewable energy alternatives, what would be your preferred source of power for Minnesota?
Well, if I can take a page from Mr. Grant and object to the premise of the question. When I was doing power...
Objection duly noted.
Since he did it first. So, when I was doing power supply planning for the Municipal Power Agency, it's not actually all that useful an exercise to sit down with a sheet of paper and say, oh, I can do nuclear at 10 cents a kilowatt hour and wind and gas combo at 8 cents a kilowatt hour. It very much varies by the kind of system you have. So the folks at Great River Energy or NSP have sophisticated computer models where they'll go and instead of, well, we're going to go and do this, they plug in a particular resource with a particular set of characteristics and see how it integrates with their whole system. So some places wind does very well. Some places they need, have a greater need for a baseload resource, and perhaps biomass would do better in that context, where you could have a plant that runs on solid fuel 24 hours a day. So it's, and we hope to get to the point where solar is more competitive. So it's, we've really shied away and consciously not taken the approach of picking the winners and the losers in what we've done in Minnesota. It's we've set a standard and have utilities go out and figure out how to meet it best for their particular utility systems, and then recognizing that circumstances change over time. Some technologies leap forward and become suddenly more competitive, and we should have that be an example. But we heard from some of the legislators earlier on, I'm very much of all of the above person. We need more wind. I'd like to see more solar. We've just really scratched the surface on the biomass, and it's not stuff that competes with fuel. It actually solves, in many cases, a couple of different problems at once, taking waste out of the waste stream and producing new and more useful products out of it. But we could use more coal. We could use more nuclear. But the key is, no matter what we do it better than we did in the previous generation.